information that's going to be presented and whatnot. So I want to welcome everybody to the Development International and Responsible Trade webinar on the Dodd-Frank Reporting Year 2016 benchmarking. This is actually the 4th year for filings and the 3rd year of the benchmarking. And so if you want to just kind of jump to the next slide. This speaking is Mike Locke. I'm founder and president of Responsible Trade, and I'll be moderating the session. The presenters will be co-author and principal investigator, Dr. Chris Bayer from Development International. And some of you may remember Chris as the author of the cost analysis that was done by Tulane in, I think, 2012, 2013 at the request of Senator Durbin when they were evaluating Dodd-Frank to begin with. Also, we have co-author and lead analyst Jesse Hudson from Development International, who will be presenting today also. Just a few housekeeping rules, because participants do include representation from governments, NGOs, industries, including associations, companies, consultants, and service providers. With that, we'll be implementing Chatham House rules, and just as a reminder, Chatham House rules allows for participants are free to use the information, but neither the identity nor the affiliation nor that or other participants may be revealed. As Jesse indicated a few minutes ago, we will be recording this webinar so that you know that and can have recordings available by contacting Chris. Also, there's a lot of information on these slides, so slides will be shared with participants. And given the amount of people on the participating, please remember to mute your lines when not speaking. And just from a format standpoint, we will take questions at the end of the session, but please feel free to add questions via the chat box during the presentations so that hopefully the speakers may be able to get to those questions as they go through and they're still fresh in your mind. I actually started working with Chris after his first report came out, as I was part of a company that had made a filing, and I disagreed with some of the indicators and some of the interpretation of the indicators. But I realized there was a lot of value in the evaluation. This was one of the first evaluations that looked at all the different filings. And that is why over the last few years, I continue to work with Chris to help improve and develop on the indicators. This includes facilitating stakeholder sessions where we solicit feedback and input. Did a real lot of that last year when we brought online the OECD indicators. And Development International continues to improve on the indicators and the evaluation criteria. I suspect we may have questions that will indicate that people do have things that they think need to be done better or interpreted differently. But this is all part of the ongoing continuous improvement process. So hopefully we'll take away some good lessons learned here and improve the indicators for next year, but also provide companies and participants a feel for what the expectations are so that they themselves can improve on their filings in the coming years. With that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who will cover if you want to go to the next 2 more slides. That's just the one slide we skipped over is just a commercial slide for responsible trade. And so what we'll do is Chris will cover the context, methodology, and big picture findings, and Jesse will then go into specific examples, and we'll then open it up for Q&A. And then given that time is tight, the speakers have agreed to stay on after the hour to answer any additional questions. So with that, thanks for joining the session, and I'll turn it over to Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Mike. And I also want to just add, it's been really great working with you over the past years, and you've greatly improved our indicators and the standing overall, and I'm really grateful for that. And thanks also for moderating moderating our session today. Yeah, so we'll start with the context. And next slide. What the UN observers are increasingly picking up is that the role of responsible sourcing programs in the upstream supply chain is actually making a dent on conflict. Now, this would have been pretty much unthinkable, probably for any observer, back when Dodd-Frank was passed, and of course, you still have to this day, you have people saying that this law is not having impact, but it's interesting to see this this observation being repeated by the group of experts. Now, the first sort of language on this was this, they would say the group believes that X, Y, Z. And now they're saying, they're getting increasingly assertive about, for example, ITSC's effect in region. And this is very interesting when you think about, all the collective efforts happening, both at the SOR level with the auditing, but also sort of the bringing online of viable upstream solutions, and them going to scale. And so this is certainly a development that sort of gives us all, I think, reason for hope that all of these collective efforts aren't just, draconian, burdensome regulation, but that there actually may be something to this theory of change that was espoused by the law. Next slide, please. So we also have this 2015 survey that was done, and this outfit's called IPIS, and this is really the only survey, to the best of my knowledge, that really covered some ground. And they surveyed over 2,000 artisanal mining sites. And what's interesting is, and you're familiar with the statistics, but what's interesting is that the majority of the 3T mines that they surveyed were actually, conflict-free, or as more specifically, the miners interviewed did not report having to, for example, in quote, share their revenue with a guy holding a gun. And so that's certainly an interesting development. And I'll ask you to skip to the next slide, Jesse, which correlates with the progress reported by the conflict-free smelting initiative or sourcing program. And they, as you see, the percent of SORs that are active or compliant out of the total SORs is increasing, and these numbers are of course impressive, especially if you would have looked at this a couple of years ago. Definitely you wouldn't have seen these numbers. So that is just impressive gains here. SOR stands for smelters or refiners, and I think Tina asked that question. Good question there. Next slide. So that's just a bit of a context. Our report goes into a bit more detail and providing sort of our perspective on sort of the in-region developments, as well as what notable stakeholders are doing or not doing. There's a couple gaps also by the U.S. government, sadly. So things that are actually required by law aren't being met there either. So there's still some work to be done. So with regard to our methodology, just real quick, we assessed 1,153 issuers, which is essentially the entire population of issuers at the time of July 10, 2017, including the SDAs, as in the amended SDs, Form SDs. And so that was our cutoff date. So any filings after that, and there have been a couple, are not included in this summary observation. Yeah, next slide. So some of you are familiar with our indicators. We essentially have two sets of indicators, one honing in on what we would define as the SEC compliance bit, and then the second dimension being the OECD conformance indicators. And we do separate them out for for various reasons. One, you have the sort of hard disclosure requirements, and then you also, a part of the rule, you have the requirement to implement a due diligence framework, nationally or internationally recognized. And so for that, we have currently for CMR filers, we have 18 indicators, and then 9 indicators on OECD indicators for the formality only filers. So, we'll you'll see some of these indicator numbers also pop up on its successive slides. Next slide, Jesse. And just kind of the disclaimer that we give for every single webinar we do of this nature. I and my team do not have a vested interest. We do not have any conflict of interest because we do not own stock or have any other interest at stake in our evaluation. If there is, some of our evaluators have worked for or been involved in cases that would have involved the company. In that case, the evaluator reports that and then is reassigned a new company. We also have systems in place where there's redundancy and where we do double checking and so on and so forth, just to make sure we have the best possible quality data we can possibly muster for this. So that, and this is something that's really important, that we make sure that our data is insulated from any special interest. Next slide. This kind of effort really can't happen. This is not a one-man job. This is not a two-man job, two-woman job, three-woman job. This is really a team. And the way the team sort of works is we would first circulate an evaluation framework to first a group of stakeholder forum members, but we also then opened it up to the public in general. And we were also this year engaged by, for example, the Aeronautics Industry Association, and also a number of issuers who reached out to us and said, hey, this indicator we understand to be this. Are you sure that's what you want to say? Or we don't agree with your interpretation of the legislative intent. Can we please review this? And so we have a number of discussions here. And then that happens, and then there's also a period where the stakeholder forum members input into the draft report. And here I have to say, incredible, important, valuable input provided by the stakeholder forum, and I'm really grateful to all those listed here. And just to highlight, Mike as well is of course our moderator here, but Lauren, Felia, Katie from iPoint. I mean, the list goes on and on of a really impressive input, and so we're just a shout out to them for making it what it came to be. Next slide. So one of the outputs, of course, is the actual report, kind of giving this overall summary data. But then, of course, we also publish at a micro level or an individual company level the scorecards. Now, here we have an example of an exemplary company that scored really well, as you can see. And so these scorecards are, of course, available. And so that is, we're not going to go into this much detail until we get to Jesse's session. And Jesse will be walking us through specific examples of how companies have, really impressive cases, or the language reflecting those cases is truly something that could be looked at. Next slide. So here's just a couple links. We'll share this presentation after the webinar, and so you'll have these URLs. And just a quick note: we will at some point make this data public. So if you'd like to engage us on your scores, now is the time. We'll probably still give it another week or so for comment, and then we'll probably close the review period. Next slide. So I need to thank iPoint and Elm for sponsoring the report for this year's report for last year's reporting year, and then going forward, we also secured funding from Asset, and so as long as this law survives, as long as it's still standing, we'll be doing these types of analyses. So we will be anticipating that for next year. Next slide. So yeah, so now to the big picture findings. Next slide. Overall, we saw a drop. Thus far, it's sort of been averaging about a 4% or almost a 4% drop over the years in terms of aggregate filers. There's a lot of movement in with mergers and acquisitions. But this year, we saw, for reporting year 2016, we saw a drop of 5.6% overall. Now that is, of course, slightly higher, but for anybody who's familiar with the political context, which I think all of us are, it's actually almost surprising that it was that little, which to me signals, just general strong compliance, and we'll get into, of course, more specifics there. Also of interest here to note is that almost 80% of the filers are CMR filers. Which means, most of these supply chains, given their global nature, are sourcing from the covered countries or believing to be sourcing. Next slide. So we had 30 filers that they filed a Form SD only, but it was very apparent based on their own language that they actually should have been doing due diligence and actually should have filed a CMR. And just to highlight one case, you have Unilever here, and the language kind of gets tricky, right? But just wanted to highlight this as one case of a company that should have filed a CMR and done due diligence. Next slide. The other thing is issuer country of headquarters. You see 979 companies were US based. But you also had Israel represented, Canada, Great Britain, Ireland, Netherlands, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. And so this law is somewhat global in that sense. Of course, the bulk of it coming out of the States or hitting companies based headquartered in the US, but also quite a number of companies abroad. Next slide. Right, so now to the compliance results of Form SD only filers. So to what extent are they living up to the law of the land, given our interpretation? We see pretty strong compliance across the board. Providing the URL back to the statement on the company's website was still a bit of a weakness there with a couple broken links here or there, or other issues with that. But in general, doing all right for some of the companies that said they conducted due diligence. In some cases, that due diligence wasn't described, but by and large, this group pretty much has it together. Next slide. So here to the SEC compliance results of the CMR filers. Again, that's almost 80% of all the filers. So this is really where the action is. By and large, you see a lot of green, right? So that's good. Green is good. Where we see sort of in this little red box here with indicator 12 and 13, where we see in quote weakness is where companies are required to list their SOR facilities and disclose their country of origin. Now, part of the reason, and we've had multiple discussions about this also with a lot of issuers, and part of the problem is, if you're relying on essentially a survey method with a CMRT or what have you, and you have a multitude, plethora of tiers, I mean, it's really involved. And so, there are inherent limits of, let's say, passive data collection in that manner. So I think going forward, and I know some companies are thinking about it, and some service providers are thinking about this as well, software vendors, is we need an active data collection systems to be built from the ground up, as in from the upstream. And blockchain comes to mind, and there's of course other solutions here, but I think this is a bit of an impasse, and this is a definite constraint here. And I know there's a number of companies that want to do better. So this is a bit of a challenge, but again, I think technology will shine a light here, and in a couple of years we might have this most in the green with the right steps being taken. Next slide. So in terms of if we look at this as a bit of a horse race here, we've got here we've got the leading horses in terms of the SIC code, and what you see is computer communications equipment in terms of SEC compliance is doing really well. You have printed circuit boards and electromedical also doing really well. The semiconductors are also in the high 80s. So it's a tight race. But this one, computer communications, won this race. Next slide. Yeah, so for the OECD conformance of Form SD only filers, this is of course where companies don't necessarily disclose in line with the OECD conformance. So they're essentially doing the RCOI and then stopping short of doing a full OECD type investigation, or if they're doing the OECD type investigation, not really spilling the beans. So this is still, I would say this is a gap. Also going forward, looking at things like the EU law, which will require robust reporting on OECD. So some of these companies, I do expect this to also improve. The digital information sharing systems is the one where they were doing quite well. And then, so the majority of companies were in the green there. Thank you, Jesse. You're heading to the next slide already, but yeah, so the digital information sharing systems is above 50%. So that's something that companies were reporting out. Next slide. So here's really where the action is, right? In terms of, potential gaps. And so here you see, companies are all over the board. We've got, in terms of the OECD steps, OECD step 1 is quite robust. But then we definitely have more work to do. And we as in royal we. And so Jesse will go into some details here in his section coming up. Next slide. And in terms of this horse race, again, it's a close one, but printed circuit boards is again in the lead here, and computer communications equipment is also a close second here. Motor vehicle parts and accessories is also doing quite well. So that's the way this race is looking for now. Next slide. So this is a graph that means quite a bit, as in communicates quite a bit of information. So we have, this is a bubble chart juxtaposing OECD conformance with SEC compliance, right? And so what we see is we see 3 companies that hit a perfect 100-100, and kudos to them. That wasn't easy, especially because we introduced 2 relatively new indicators this year to the OECD section, which means these companies aren't just waiting for indicators. They're going out and really devouring the OECD guide and doing their own homework, and then hitting point after point. And, not just in the report, but of course, giving enough detail to lend credibility, plausibility to the case they're making in their filing. But so those 3 companies are, of course, stellar examples. But we also notably have a whole 313 companies. So that's 27% of all filers that earned at least a 75 combined score. And that is almost 200 companies more than last year for reporting year 2015. So what that means to me is, you remember the very first figure, we saw a couple of companies drop out, right? So if we think of it as a spear, we have, at the front, we have this metal tip, and the metal tip grew essentially, threefold, right? The metal tip, we've got a really robust metal tip now, and then the back of the spear got chopped off, the very rear end got chopped off, but the spear is considerably heavier, as in there's a lot more momentum behind due diligence now in the aggregate in terms of what we're picking up from our data. So this is a significant finding. Next slide. A couple of things, this is one thing Mike has been concerned with for some time is implausible country of origin and SOR countries. And so here we see an improvement in terms of companies not reporting implausible CO and SORs or their countries. And so we still had 113 filers report implausible CO or CORs, but it's much better. It's reduced by almost 2/3. So improvement here, but watch out for these 11 countries. If you see anybody saying my gold comes out of Luxembourg, well, maybe not. Next slide. So trade law compliance is another thing. This is of course not foreseen by the law, but the transparency that this law provides in terms of disclosure also opens up issues such as trade compliance. And I think all of us understand that by buying gold from North Korea, even indirectly, maybe beneficial to, let's say, persona non grata from the U.S. government point of view at the moment. So beware of the Central Bank of the Democratic Republic of the Democratic Republic of Korea, and then also there's filers that are listing North Sudan as an SOR country. Jesse, it's possible that you've got an ambulance in the background. You mind muting real quick?
Sorry.
And we also have other filers who are, based on the SDN, the Special Designated Nationals list, that are exposing themselves to specific risk in their supply chain. For example, Fidelity Printers, it does business with the Sino Zimbabwe Development Ltd, which is a sanctioned entity. So, just beware of the trade compliance. Next slide, please. So the last issue that I want to speak to, and then we'll be handing it over in short order. The IPSA filers. So we looked at all the filings, and anybody who used the magic words DRC conflict free explicit, as in sort of using that term, we would have flagged. And then we would look at, if you're using the term, did you procure an IPSA? And in most cases, it's a yes, but in 9 cases, it's a no. And if it's a no, that's not good, because then you're explicitly in contravention of SEC advice thus far. So something to look out for. Next slide. Note the specific examples, and I think I have one more slide, and then we'll hand it over to you, Jesse. Just a quick observation: the high-scoring companies usually exhibit a particular, well, let me say a pattern emerges if you study their CMRs. So it becomes apparent with the high scores that they have a really robust risk management operation. And it's not necessarily just a risk management operation vis-a-vis conflict minerals. You know, there's corporate culture that I think plays into this as well. But you can tell by their policy systems and processes that they're serious. And by the way, these risk management operations, you know, today we're talking about conflict minerals, but tomorrow we might be talking human slavery, the day after child labor, et cetera. So, you know, this goes to show that, you know, these of course are systems, processes, et cetera, that usually, you know, can be somewhat agnostic in scope as well. The other thing is that these companies, they operationalize or they instrumentalize a third party. So it's not that they just outsource this to the third party and, you know, job is done, but they use the third party to their own end. And it becomes very clear in their language, you know, that they take ownership of the inputs and the outcomes. And I think that definitely distinguishes the sheep from the goats right there. Right. Well, with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Chris. And not only thanks to you, but to everybody on the call who put in many hours of effort putting together these CMRs and running these programs. What I'm going to do is give some specific examples from some of the best CMRs that I came across, starting with 2 SEC compliance indicators and then going through about 9 OECD conformance indicators, with a few of those bundled together as 2 or 3 from a single CMR. So beginning with SEC compliance indicator number 11, products described. Here, what Illinois Toolworks did is reported clearly on their scoping process for determining which products were in scope for the purposes of the rule, and then included that product list in their CMR under a separate heading, which A, made it very clear, and B, did not make the mistake that many companies did, which was making a generalized statement of the products that the company produces and not specifying which of those products were in scope for the purposes of the rule. As Chris mentioned earlier, this indicator was one of the lowest scores, if not the lowest score, of our SEC compliance indicators, specifically asking whether an issuer disclosed countries of origin. Here, Chemet, which was the first to file this year, included a country of origin list at the bottom of its SOR list, which is a place many other filers included theirs as well. And some filers even went as granular as detailing which COOs each SOR was likely to have, rather than a generalized COO list, breaking it down on the SOR level. What Chemet also did that I liked was it passed the basic plausibility test by including only countries of origin where there are actually mines. Many COO lists, too many, included countries that don't have mines, such as Hong Kong or Singapore or Belgium. Moving now to the OECD indicators. Here, Woodward satisfied OECD indicators 2 and 11, which both are specifically focused on this kind of risk management system, and components of that risk management system, I should say, specifically an organizational structure and reporting to senior managers. As you can see here, Woodward not only described its organizational structure in detail, but it chartered compliance as a formal project. And in doing so, it took advantage of all of the resources available within the business for formal projects. And then by establishing an internal team with specific hierarchy and reporting requirements within the team, and then situating that team within a specific group of the company, the global supply chain, Woodward was able to implement a highly effective organizational structure, and then here as the final point, clearly designate a senior manager responsible for the program, the corporate VP of global supply chain. This indicator was a new indicator this year. And what it asks was whether an issuer required suppliers to source from only verified conflict-free SORs, or otherwise stated as audited SORs. Only 30 out of 1,153 companies earned this point. And as you can see, JCPenney earned it with a requirement for suppliers included within its conflict minerals policy that all suppliers were required to adhere to. Here, Huntington Ingalls satisfied OEC indicators 3, 8, and 9, which focused on the use of digital information sharing systems such as the CMRT, the engagement with SORs to obtain information, and the assessment of whether SORs implemented their own due diligence practices. Now, what Huntington Ingalls Industries did here is used a third-party service provider for all of these things, effectively implementing an outsourcing program and leveraging the available tools and the available organizations out there in order to have a more effective conflict minerals program. The third-party service provider engaged directly with SORs on behalf of Huntington Ingalls and assessed SOR due diligence as well. Not only that, but distributed CMRTs, tracked CMRT responses, and gave that information to the company. OEC Indicator 13, asking whether the issuers exercise leverage over upstream suppliers, focused on true upstream suppliers, which are from mine to SOR, those supplying raw minerals and raw ore to the smelters or refiners. And in order to build leverage over such suppliers, the best action to take was to work in region, to support civil society in the DRC and in the conflict region, to support certain networks such as whistleblowing and monitoring and reporting, and finally to drill down into specific minerals such as gold and focus on solutions within the gold supply chain. You can see that here in the second paragraph, highlighted in bold, Apple participated in the RAGS forum and focused on issues with artisanal gold exported from the DRC to a major gold refiner. Other civil society organizations like the Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade, ITSCI, and a number of others all work in region, and providing support to them and engaging them in partnerships was a great way to build leverage over upstream suppliers. Here, what we're looking for specifically is a comparison of SOR data year over year, which is relatively simple to do, but something that many companies did not include in their report. Even though they've been engaging in this process for multiple years now, they didn't compare their data year over year, as On Semiconductor did here, showing that over the years, the percentage of SORs that have been verified as CFSP compliant has almost doubled, from 53% to 98% of SORs in their supply chain. OEC indicator number 17 was another new indicator this year, and it asks whether an issuer identified high-risk SORs in its supply chain, and then what it did to mitigate the risks of those SORs in its supply chain. Specifically, what Brooks Automation did is disclose those high-risk SORs, but didn't name them, and then disclosed its process for following up with them. In a side note, 88 companies out of 1,153 are in this point. TriMas, instead of taking the route that Brooks Automation did, which was going it alone, outsourced to a third-party service provider the risk mitigation activities as well as the identification of high-risk SORs. So you can see in the language that I copied from their CMR here, they have scoring criteria for SORs depending upon geographic proximity to the DRC and covered countries, their audit status, and then known or plausible evidence of unethical or conflict sourcing. And then identified the following facilities as high-risk SORs. And when those were encountered in their supply chain, implemented risk mitigation activities. Now, I've taken all these examples and worked with Chris to produce a document called The Good, the Bad, and the Tricky, highlighting some of the best examples, a few of the harder ones, and a few of the ones that were on the fence. This is a sequel to Good, the Bad, and the Tricky 1, which we put out last year. And we also put out a similar document for our Katiska study on forced labor and human trafficking. Just a little bit of advice to companies and a way to share some low-hanging fruit on indicators that I noticed could have been improved upon with simple semantics and or erring on the side of disclosing rather than keeping things hidden. And one of those is the listing of these in-scope products. Any company that does an RCOI process should be doing a scoping process as well, determining which of its products are in scope for the purposes of the rule, which products contain 3TG. So that information being readily available when shared in the report earns a point. Second, it's pretty clear by now that most companies include in their contract terms and conditions clauses pertaining to conflict minerals reporting, whether requiring that suppliers fill CMRTs or requiring that suppliers implement their own due diligence practices. And so by reporting on the inclusion of those clauses in contract terms and conditions, and in that way taking ownership of the agency that companies have in this system to really affect the change, whether or not Dodd-Frank survives, there will still be such requirements, even from industry peers, placed upon companies to manage effectively their supply chains and ensure that their supply chains don't contain minerals coming from conflict regions. And so that agency, as we've learned through our discussions with companies in the follow-up to this report, is often implemented through contract terms and conditions. And third, while many companies said senior management was briefed as a blanket statement, fewer designated which senior manager was responsible for the program, and thus didn't earn a point for this indicator. Now, in the canopy, we have the best leaves and some of the best fruit, but it's the hardest to get to. And this kind of reiterates the slide at the beginning of this section that Chris walked you through, that spoke of what some of the best companies are doing. Specifically, the level of diligence that goes into learning the COOs of each SOR within a company's supply chain, and remembering that there are certain countries where there are no mines, but are still reported by suppliers, and doing due diligence on those CMRTs to understand why a supplier is reporting a country without a mine, such as Hong Kong, as a country of origin. And the standard being reasonable certainty here for COOs, because it's apparent that you can't always have full certainty as to whether the minerals in your supply chain are coming from a certain country. Next, these in-region activities, just skipping over the second point there, such as Apple did working in the DRC region to build leverage over suppliers who are in the true upstream. And then finally, this participation and on multiple levels, including participating in executive committees and specific groups and teams, such as the smelter engagement team, of industry organizations like the CFSI, the AIAG, ITSCI, and many more.